No event in recent British history resonates quite so strongly in the collective British mind as the Second World War. It's everywhere. It's in our politics, it's in our sense of who we are, and it's even in our entertainment industry. And that's unsurprising. I mean, of course it is. It seems ridiculous to say that the Second World War was a big event. We all know that. It claimed 380,000 British personnel lives in the Second World War. 70,000 civilians were killed in the bombing which reduced our great cities to rubble. And something else happened. We won. We were on the winning side in the defeat of the most horrific, egregious dictatorship that strutted the stage of the 20th century. And that is something that our recent ancestors, and indeed us, should be awfully proud of. But you would think that given that this is so important, we would be getting the key parts of it right. And in fact, quite often, and sometimes quite deliberately, that's not happening. So let's start with Winston Churchill. Everybody knows Winston. And if you ever walk through Parliament Square, you can't help but be reminded of him. His 4-metre-high effigy looms over the surrounding area. His shadow cast both literally and metaphorically across Westminster. A day, a week, an hour can't go by without some politician or pundit or think tank evoking his memory. And one recent Prime Minister even seemed to base his entire political career on a sort of elaborate cosplay of Winston. We all know Winston. Close your eyes and you can see him. You can see the Homburg hat, the cigar, the thing he did with his fingers, sometimes got it the wrong way around, the prodigious amount of alcohol he famously drank, those famous wartime speeches, and courtesy of the internet, we can learn all of the other witty, incisive things he said. Stuff like, George is better than war. Or, if you're going through hell, keep going. That's my inner Winston. It was Churchill who observed that if you're not a liberal by 25, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative by 35, you don't have a brain. And then there's those funny kind of anecdotal stories, like the time Nancy Astor said to him, Winston, you're impossible. If I was married to you, I'd put poison in your coffee. Only for Churchill to reply, if I was married to you, I'd drink it. As proof of his sort of international reputation, when Ron DeSantis recently quit the American presidential race, he fell back on Winston's words. The line, he fell back on Winston's words with a line, never believe anything you read on the internet. No, he didn't. But he should have done, because everything I've just said is bunkum. Churchill never said any of those things. And Ron DeSantis' quote, which was, success is not final, failure is not fatal, it's courage that counts, was actually a Budweiser beer commercial from 1938. The line about if you're not a liberal by 25, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative by 35, you don't have a brain, that's utterly ridiculous, because Winston Churchill was a conservative at 25 and a liberal at 35. But it doesn't really matter, because those quotes are all made up. And you might think, so what? Why is this guy wasting his time worrying about fake quotes on the internet? Well, the problem is that fake Churchill quotes sit at the tip of the iceberg of fake Churchill mythology. And this huge cottage industry is something which I think Winston himself would have been rather pleased about, because nobody put in the hours in forging the fake Churchill myth quite like Winston himself. In fact, that 4-metre-high statue in Parliament Square, he chose the spot where it would go. It's extremely prominent. And as a result, successive generations of politicians have been obliged to walk past Winston every day on their way to work. Now, that has a deep psychological imprint on people. Churchill also got in first on the history. He wrote a famous 6-volume account of World War II, which put this guy called Winston Churchill center stage in all of the action, getting all the calls right in the Second World War. And this hugely successful version of events is the one that resonated with us. That's the one we see in films like The Darkest Hour. That's the one where Winston goes into the underground and chats to ordinary people. That's the fake Churchill mythology. The real Churchill was not this cartoonish super politician, but a complex, paradoxical man who over the course of his very long career got a lot of things wrong. Back in the First World War, it was he who orchestrated the Dardanelles campaign in 1915, which was a disaster. Throughout his wilderness years, he got all sorts of things wrong and was a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist who really, really committed himself to stopping Indian independence. That sits at odds with our idea of Churchill as being this sort of savior of freedom. Because yes, he believed in saving Western freedom and British freedom, but he did not extend the courtesy to the people of the empire. And that's a problem. The trouble is that if you start saying these things, you upset people, because people want to believe in the myth. They want to believe in that super being and not in the real story of war. And that leads me on to Dunkirk. Everybody knows the story of Dunkirk. That moment in May 1940 when a flotilla of small boats went across the English Channel to rescue people off the beaches of France. The 2017 Christopher Nolan film. This gave rise to the notion of Dunkirk Spirit. Dunkirk Spirit is the idea that British people, or specifically British passport holders, have a sort of magic DNA which enables us to overcome adversity. And during the recent pandemic, it was invoked by Boris Johnson. On at least a dozen occasions, actually, government ministers invoked Dunkirk Spirit. And Johnson said that the little labs could be the little boats of our era. Now, I can't actually see you, but I'm guessing you're an intelligent bunch of people. Flattery always works, as Winston Churchill never said. Of course, and I'm sorry to break it to you if you are a British passport holder, of course you don't have magical DNA. Yeah? It's a myth, and it's a myth based on a myth, because in May 1940, people did not hop in little rowing boats and go across the English Channel to rescue the British Expeditionary Force. The Royal Navy and the Coast Guard did. And to that end, they requisitioned small boats from the south coast, often without the owner's knowledge, and they took them across to ferry the British soldiers from the shoreline to the ship. This gave rise to a myth that ordinary people had done it, and it was a useful myth at the time. A useful myth because Britain felt imperiled, and the propaganda of the time encouraged people to believe that it was a David and Goliath struggle, which I'm afraid to say again is absolute nonsense. Britain in 1940 had the biggest navy by far in the world. It was twice the size of the German navy. Britain, yes, had retreated, but really this was a failure of politics and a failure of government to hold Nazi Germany to account. That myth was necessary, the myth of Dunkirk in 1940, but should we really be trotting it out in 2024? I don't think so. And that brings me to my final myth. It's the myth that would have us believe that World War II was a sort of glorious thing. In my childhood, way back in the 1970s, when everything was black and white, I loved, like a lot of boys of my age, playing soldiers. I had a whole cupboard full of sort of machine guns made of plastic, and I had two action men, a 6-inch high model and a 6-foot model in my father, who had fought in the Second World War. I was an expert on War Age 10 because I'd seen Where Eagles Dare and The Great Escape, and I'd even seen Dad's Army live at the Harlow Palladium. And so when I went for walks with my dad, I would test his knowledge, just to see what he knew. And I regret to inform you that he let me down consistently, because not once in the Second World War did my dad jump barbed wire on a motorbike, dig a tunnel, or exchange witty banter with a captured German submarine captain. My dad's stories were very often about running away, hiding, exchanging wine, and on one occasion, coming face to face with the enemy and fleeing for his life. They were stories of fear and of a young man caught up in circumstances beyond his control. And that is the truth of most people's experience of World War II. None of that generation chose to be there. And so when I see that war weaponized, whether it be Churchill, whether it be Dunkirk, whether it be anything else, I ask us to remember the truth. Thank you.